They handed me a cardboard box at 6:47 in the morning, not a phone call, not a sit-down meeting with HR and a box of tissues on the table. An email, sent at 6:15 a.m. before most people's alarms go off, telling me to report to the third floor before I could even get through my first cup of coffee. And when I got there, Trent Holland was already standing in the lobby with a security guard at his side, arms crossed, wearing the kind of expression that takes practice. My name is Wade Calloway. I'm 50 years old. And that morning, I had been the chief strategy officer of Holland Capital Group for 28 years. 28 years. I started when the building still had carpet from the 80s, and the fax machine was considered cutting edge. I'd seen 3 recessions move through that company like weather systems, slow at first, then all at once. I'd survived 2 ownership transitions, watched 4 CEOs come and go, and outlasted more rebrands than I could count without pulling the archives. Restructured the entire operations division in 2019, and personally negotiated a supply chain framework that cut our annual overhead by $38 million. My name was on more contracts than I could track without going back through the files, and I was getting walked out the door before the coffee cart showed up. Trent, 33 years old, Harvard MBA, the CEO's only son, 3 months into a VP title nobody on the senior team thought he'd earned, handed me a sealed envelope. I didn't open it right away. I looked at the word terminated printed at the top of the cover letter visible through the fold, and I set it back on the desk. The company is moving in a new direction, he said. We need leadership that aligns with our digital transformation strategy. I've heard a lot of corporate language in 28 years. That sentence was the emptiest version of all of it. I tapped my finger on the desk 3 times. Slow, evenly spaced. You're doing this today, I said. You understand what's happening today. He understood. The entire building understood. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, we were supposed to sit down with Nolan Graves, CEO of Graves Energy, a man I had personally worked with for 15 years across 4 separate deals, and sign a $4 billion exclusive supply contract, the single largest transaction in Holland Capital's history, a deal I had spent 3 years building from a cold call into a signed term sheet, flying back and forth, sitting through dinners that ran until midnight, rebuilding trust every time something fell through on our end. There was a key person clause buried in that agreement. I had insisted on it during the 3rd round of negotiations, when Nolan's legal team was pushing back on timeline guarantees. The clause named me specifically. It said that if I left the company before closing, for any reason other than death or medical leave, Graves Energy had the right to walk away without penalty. I'd put it there because I understood something that Trent clearly didn't. Nolan Graves wasn't doing business with Holland Capital. He was doing business with me. Trent glanced at the security guard rather than at me. We'll handle the signing internally. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, folded it over one arm, and walked to the elevator without another word. 9 floors. That's what I had. The lobby was already moving when the doors slid open, morning staff filing in with cups from the cart outside, a couple of board members arriving early for what was supposed to be a historic day, and standing near the main entrance surrounded by his team of 6 advisors and attorneys was Nolan Graves himself. He was early. With Nolan, early always meant the same thing. He was ready, he was committed, and he expected the other side to be the same. He spotted me before I'd taken 3 steps off the elevator, crossed the lobby directly. Wade. He extended his hand and shook it the way he always did. Firm. No theater. Ready to make some history today? There's been a change, I said. I'm no longer with the company. He didn't release my hand. Say that again. Terminated this morning. Effective immediately. Behind me I heard Trent's shoes on the marble. Fast steps. Closing the gap. Mr. Graves, if we could step into the conference room, the team is prepared and we're ready to move forward on schedule. Nolan let go of my hand and turned around, slowly. When a man who built a $4 billion energy operation from a single regional fuel distributor in Tulsa turns and looks at you the way Nolan looked at Trent Holland in that lobby, you learn something about the difference between authority and title. Real authority doesn't need volume. You fired the man who built this deal, he said. Flat, not a question, on signing day. It was a personnel decision, sir. It has no bearing whatsoever on the terms of the contract or our ability to. It has every bearing on the contract. Nolan looked at me one more time. Something passed between us that didn't need words. Then he turned to his team. We're leaving." The lobby went quiet in the way that large spaces go quiet when everyone in them is holding their breath. 18 Holland employees within earshot. Board members by the elevator bank. Not one of them spoke. I'd worked alongside most of them for the better part of a decade. I set the cardboard box on the edge of the security desk, nodded once to the guard, a guy named Pete who'd been at that post since 2003 and knew me by my coffee order, and walked out the front door. The morning air hit cold and clean. I stood on the sidewalk for maybe a full minute, just breathing it. No agenda, no calls to make. For the first time in years, not a single thing on the calendar. Then I flagged a cab, turned my phone off, and went home. Nobody prepares you for what the first few days actually feel like. You expect anger. Maybe you expect to sit at your kitchen table running through every conversation, every decision, looking for the moment. You could have seen it coming. That's what people assume happens. What actually happened was, I slept. Deeply, without an alarm. The way I hadn't since sometime in my early 40s when the job started running 24 hours in my head even when I was horizontal. I woke up the first morning and it was past 8 and the apartment was quiet and I lay there for a while just listening to it. I made actual breakfast. Eggs, toast, the whole thing. Not the granola bar grabbed off the counter on the way to catch a 7 a.m. call. I sat at the table and ate it without looking at a screen. I called my brother Colton on day 2. He runs a contracting business outside Columbus, builds decks and additions, knows every subcontractor in a 40-mile radius, and has strong opinions about wood grain and concrete mix ratios. We talked for almost 2 hours about a fishing trip we'd been half planning for 3 years, about a truck he was thinking of buying, about our father's old toolbox that neither of us had figured out what to do with. Not one word about Holland Capital. It was the best conversation I'd had in months. By day 4, I turned the phone back on. 74 messages. I went through them slowly, over a second cup of coffee, not rushing. Former colleagues I hadn't heard from in years, some reaching out with genuine concern, a few clearly just fishing for information. A handful of recruiters who'd seen the headlines without reading the full story. 3 board members from companies I'd helped through deals in previous years, each leaving some version of "let me know if there's anything I can do." One of them, a man who ran a mid-sized logistics operation out of Cincinnati, left a voicemail that ended with, "Whatever happened over there, Wade, those people didn't deserve you." I saved that one. I'm not usually the type who saves voicemails. Holland Capital's stock had dropped 31% on the day of the walkout. By the following morning, it was down another 18%. Someone in that lobby had talked. I had a strong suspicion who, though I never confirmed it. And by noon on day 1, every financial trade outlet was running a variation of the same story. Graves Energy withdraws from $4 billion deal following CSO termination. The wire services had it by evening. By morning, it was in print. The market had given its verdict. Now I needed to decide what to do with mine. Philip Holland called me personally on day 6. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd been sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the street below do nothing in particular, and when his name came up on the screen, I held the phone for a few seconds before answering. Part of me wanted to see how many times he'd call before giving up. The other part, the part that had spent 28 years solving problems for that company, picked up. He sounded like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Philip Holland was 68 years old, 3 months from a retirement he'd been planning for 2 years, and he'd spent 4 decades building a company that his son had just taken a sledgehammer to in a single morning. "Wade, we need to talk. I'm listening. The board wants to meet." He paused. I could hear him choosing his words the way a man does when he knows there's no good version of what he's about to say. "The situation here is worse than we anticipated. I know what the situation is, Philip. I've been reading the same reports you have. We need you to come back, to stabilize the client relationships, to get Nolan back to the table, to—" He stopped again. "To fix this." I got up from my chair and walked to the kitchen window. The street below was going about its business. A woman power walking with a stroller, a UPS truck double parked with the hazards on. The city completely indifferent to the crisis unfolding at Holland Capital Group. "What are you offering?" I asked. He named a number. It was lower than my previous salary. I let the silence sit for about 5 seconds. "Try again," I said, and ended the call. He called back the next day, and the day after that. By the 3rd call, the number had moved significantly. By the 4th, I told him to have the board ready on Thursday. I wore the same suit I'd had on the morning they walked me out. The one I'd been wearing when Pete the security guard took my badge and Trent stood there with his arms crossed like he'd just won something. I didn't do it for drama. I did it because I wanted every person in that boardroom to have to look at it and know exactly which morning they were trying to undo. Trent wasn't in the room. That absence told me everything I needed to know about how the board currently assessed his judgment. I sat down, opened the folder my attorney had prepared, and slid it across the table to the chairman without any opening remarks. "These terms aren't a starting point," I said. "This is where we land." The document ran 3 pages. Triple my previous salary, a seat on the board with full voting rights, complete strategic autonomy, no lateral sign-off, required on any deal I initiated or structured. And the clause that made 2 of the older board members sit forward in their chairs, 55% controlling ownership of any new business initiative I developed during my tenure. The company would hold a non-controlling 45% stake and receive proportional revenue, but decision-making authority would be mine entirely. "That's highly unusual," said the board member on the far left. A man named Garrett, who'd been on the audit committee for 11 years and prided himself on being the voice of caution in every room. "So is terminating your chief strategy officer by email at 6 in the morning on the day of the largest contract signing in company history," I said. "Consider it insurance against future misunderstandings." Nobody laughed. Nobody was supposed to. They looked at each other the way people do when they've run the numbers in their heads and don't like the answer but can't find a better one. The chairman, a man I'd worked alongside through 2 ownership transitions, picked up his pen without another word. One by one, around the table, they all signed. Getting Nolan back was a different kind of problem. I called him that same evening from my apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me and nothing written on it. He answered on the second ring, which I took as a reasonable sign. "Wade, Nolan." A pause. Not hostile. Careful. "You know how much I respect you," he said. "I've told you that for 15 years and I meant it every time. But I watched your company walk you out of a building on the most important day of a 3-year negotiation, in front of my entire team. That's not something I set aside easily. I'm not asking you to set it aside," I said. "What I'm asking is that you separate the company from the person you're actually doing business with. You weren't signing that contract with Holland Capital. You were signing it with me. That's why the key person clause is in there. And now I have the legal, contractual authority, in writing, enforceable, with real consequences if breached, to guarantee every commitment I make to you." Silence on the line. With Nolan, silence was never empty. He processed out loud with other people. With me, he went quiet when he was actually thinking. "The terms will be different," he said. "I know. I'm not talking about minor adjustments, Wade. Significantly different. I expected that. Margin, timeline, performance benchmarks, all of it gets reopened." "Agreed." Another pause. Longer this time. "Walk me through why I should believe the same situation won't happen again in 6 months," he said. "Give me the actual argument, not the corporate version." So I did. I walked him through the contract clause by clause. I explained the board seat, the autonomy provisions, the ownership structure on new ventures. I told him that for the first time in 28 years, I had contractual leverage inside that company. Not just institutional trust, which had proven to be worth exactly nothing when it mattered. I told him that if they ever tried to move me out again, they'd be unwinding a legal structure that would cost them more than the deal was worth. He asked questions, specific ones, the kind that told me he'd been thinking about this before I called. We went back and forth for nearly 2 hours. By the end, the deal was still alive, restructured, yes, with terms that had moved in his favor across almost every line item, but alive. "I'll have my team send revised heads of terms by Friday," he said finally. "I'll be ready." "Wade," he paused one more time, "don't make me regret this." "I never have," I said. "The renegotiated deal took 10 months to close. The final terms weren't what I'd originally built. The margin was thinner, the timeline was compressed, and there was a quarterly performance review tied directly to my continued leadership, something Nolan's lawyers had insisted on and I'd agreed to without hesitation. It wasn't the deal I'd spent 3 years constructing. But it was real, it was signed, and it was enough to stop Holland Capital's bleeding and give the company a credible path forward. And the whole time it was happening, I was building something else entirely. I'd been thinking about Legacy Consulting Group for longer than I'd admitted to anyone, including myself. The idea didn't come from getting fired. It came from watching what happened to companies when the people who actually held them together walked out the door. I'd seen it twice at Holland alone, once in 2009 during the first ownership transition, once in 2016 during the second. Both times, the new leadership had looked at the senior team and seen a payroll line item instead of an institutional library. Both times, they'd cut aggressively and then spent the next 18 months trying to figure out why everything kept breaking down in ways nobody could diagnose. I knew why. The people who knew why a process existed, not just how it worked, but the specific failure it had been designed to prevent, were gone. And nobody had written any of it down because nobody thought they'd ever need to. That was the problem I wanted to solve, not for Holland, for every mid-sized company sitting on the edge of a generational handoff with no idea how much they were about to lose. 6 months after I returned, I registered Legacy Consulting Group as a separate LLC. The 55% ownership clause in my contract with Holland, the one the board had signed without fully reading or without reading at all in Garrett's case, based on the look on his face when the Forbes piece ran, made the legal structure clean and defensible. Every framework I built, every client relationship I developed through Legacy, every methodology I put on paper belonged to the company I owned. Holland held a non-controlling 45% stake and collected proportional revenue from it. That had been part of the deal they signed. It was right there on page 2. The first person I brought in was Renee Caldwell. Renee had been running product development at Holland for 9 years. She was 44 years old, sharp in the way that doesn't announce itself. And she had a quality I've rarely found in corporate environments. She could tell you exactly what was wrong with an organization without needing anyone to validate the observation first. I'd watched her sit in meetings where the consensus was clearly wrong and wait, patiently, until the consequences proved her right, rather than waste breath arguing. That's a skill most people never develop. I laid out the model over lunch at a place near the office. A diner, nothing fancy. The kind of spot where the booths have high backs and nobody can hear your conversation. Boutique consultancy, operational transitions and succession planning, target clients, family-owned businesses in that 18 to 36-month window before a leadership handoff, when the institutional knowledge is most at risk and the incoming generation is most likely to mistake confidence for competence. She listened without interrupting, which was another thing I'd always respected about her. When I finished, she put down her fork. "I'm in," she said. "When do we start?" "We already have," I said. The first 90 days were slower than I'd expected. That's not a complaint. I'd planned for slow. Legacy wasn't a concept I was rushing to market. I was building something meant to last, which meant taking the time to get the methodology right before putting it in front of clients. Renee and I spent those months developing the diagnostic framework we'd eventually use with every client. A structured process for identifying where institutional knowledge lived in an organization, who held it, and what happened to it if they left tomorrow. We got our first paying client in month 4, a family-owned manufacturing company in the Chicago suburbs, 3rd generation, father preparing to hand over to his daughter. Classic situation. The father knew where every load-bearing wall was and had never written down a single one of them because for 30 years he'd never needed to. His daughter was smart, capable, and walking into a building she didn't fully understand yet. We spent 3 months with them. By the end, they had a documented operational playbook, a transition timeline, and a communication structure between the 2 generations that actually worked. The daughter called me 6 months later to say it had gone smoother than anyone had expected. The father called separately to say the same thing, which told me everything I needed to know about whether we'd done the job right. That referral led to 2 more clients. Those led to 3. By the end of year 1, Legacy had billed $12 million and had a waiting list. The Forbes piece ran about 8 months after I returned to Holland. The journalist had found me through a contact at Graves Energy. I've always suspected it was Nolan himself, though he denied it when I asked, which with Nolan means it probably was him. The headline read, "Age Discrimination in the Boardroom, One Executive's Answer." I hadn't pitched the angle. The reporter had drawn her own conclusions from the facts, which I'd laid out without editorializing. Nolan gave a quote. He said that institutional knowledge was the most systematically undervalued asset in American business, and that any company willing to discard decades of operational experience for the sake of optics deserved exactly what it got. It was the kind of quote that doesn't get pulled back after publication. It ran in 14 trade publications within the first week and ended up in 3 business school case studies by the end of the year. The phone rang for 3 weeks straight. The Holland board found out about Legacy the same way most of the business world did, reading it over their morning coffee. The chairman called me within the hour. His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying to control a reaction. "You could have told us," he said. "I did tell you," I said. Page 2, Section 4, Paragraph 3. "The contract you signed, all of you." A long pause. "The board is going to have questions about focus," he said, "about whether this creates a conflict of—" "The board approved an employment contract that explicitly authorized this structure," I said. "If there are questions, they're about the board's own due diligence, not about my conduct." He didn't call back after that, not about Legacy, anyway. Philip retired on schedule 3 months after my return, as quietly as a man can leave a company his family had run for 40 years. Outside leadership came in. A woman named Carol Briggs, recruited from a competitor, no Holland family connection, no emotional stake in protecting anyone's legacy except the company's. She was exactly what the place needed. Trent was moved to a junior advisory role within the first month of Carol's tenure. He resigned 14 months after the morning he'd handed me that envelope, announcing on LinkedIn that he was pursuing an entrepreneurial opportunity in the fintech space. I read the post once and didn't think about it again. I had a company to run. By year 3, Legacy Consulting Group had 24 people on staff and a client list that included 6 companies most people in our sector would recognize by name. We weren't the biggest consultancy in the space. We weren't trying to be. The model worked precisely because we stayed focused: operational transitions, succession planning, institutional knowledge preservation for family-owned and founder-led businesses in that critical window before a handoff. We didn't chase Fortune 500 contracts or try to expand into strategy work or M&A advisory. Every time someone suggested we broaden the scope, I said the same thing. We do one thing, we do it better than anyone else, and we don't dilute it. Renee ran the day-to-day operations with the same clarity she'd brought to every room I'd ever watched her work in. I handled business development and the senior client relationships, the founders, the patriarchs, the men and women who'd spent 30 or 40 years building something and were now trying to figure out how to hand it off without watching it fall apart in the next generation's hands. Those conversations required a specific kind of credibility. You can't learn it from a case study. You have to have lived something close enough to it that the person across the table believes you understand what's actually at stake for them. I understood. Every single time. In year 4, a private equity group that had been tracking our growth for about 18 months reached out through an intermediary. They wanted to discuss acquisition. I took the meeting, which is not the same thing as agreeing to anything. But I took it. They put a number on the table before I'd poured the water. $45 million. I owned 55% of Legacy Consulting Group. I did the math while the man across from me was still explaining the rationale for the valuation. I didn't pick up a pen. I didn't change my expression. I just let him finish, asked 4 specific questions about the earnout structure and transition timeline, and told him I'd have my attorney respond within the week. We closed on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 years and 3 months after Pete the security guard had taken my badge at the front desk of Holland Capital Group. No cardboard box, no security escort, no emails sent before sunrise. I signed the papers at our own conference table, in our own office. The one I'd leased on a personal check 4 years earlier when the LLC had exactly 2 employees and a methodology we hadn't finished writing yet. When the wire confirmation came through on my phone, I set it face down on the table and sat with it for about 30 seconds. Then I picked it up and called Renee. That evening, I took the whole team to dinner. Not a catered thing in a conference room, a real restaurant, round tables, open bar, the kind of night where people actually talk to each other instead of standing around with plates in their hands making small talk about the quarter. Renee stood up at some point and raised her glass. "To second acts," she said. I tapped the table 3 times. Then I raised mine. People ask me the same question every time I tell this story. They want to know if I was angry. If watching Trent lose his title, watching the stock price scrape along the floor for 2 years, watching the company I'd given 28 years to shrink to half its former size, if any of that felt like satisfaction. Here's the honest answer. I didn't spend much time watching any of it. I was busy. But I want to talk about the other part of the question, because what people are really asking, underneath the part about anger and satisfaction, is whether any of this is actually possible, whether the story I just told is something that happens to real people, or whether it's the version you tell yourself when you're lying awake at 2 in the morning trying to make sense of what happened to you. I've met a lot of men the past few years who went through something close to what I went through. Not the same details, the details are always different, but the same shape. There was a guy I'll call Ray, operations manager at a regional bank 26 years in, new ownership came in, brought their own people, and Ray got a meeting on a Friday afternoon that ended with a handshake and a severance packet. He told me he sat in his car in the parking garage for 45 minutes before he could drive home. Not because he was falling apart, because he genuinely could not understand what had just happened. He'd done everything right for 26 years, and it hadn't mattered. There was another man. I met him at a conference about a year after Legacy launched, who'd been a plant manager at a manufacturing company for 31 years. The company got acquired. The new owners flew in a team of consultants who were 28 years old on average and had never run a production floor in their lives. Within 8 months, they'd optimized 3 processes right into the ground and couldn't figure out why output was down. He knew exactly why. Nobody asked him. Both of those men had the same look when they told me their stories. A kind of bewildered steadiness, like they'd absorbed the hit and were still standing but hadn't quite figured out what direction to walk yet. Here's what I'd tell them, and what I wish someone had told me on that sidewalk outside Holland Capitol on a cold morning with a cardboard box in my hands. You didn't miscalculate. They did. They looked at 28 years, or 26, or 31, and saw a cost center instead of a foundation. They confused a title with the person holding it. They assumed that what you knew could be replaced by someone younger and cheaper, and they were wrong in a way they were about to find out the hard way. The market is unsentimental. It doesn't care about org charts or digital transformation strategies or what some 33-year-old VP decided on a Tuesday morning. It cares about whether the work actually gets done and whether the people doing it know what they're doing. That's the thing about real experience. Nobody can email it away from you. It doesn't sit in a building you can be walked out of. It doesn't live in a badge that gets handed to a security guard. It lives in you, and it goes where you go, and it builds whatever you decide to build next. I decided to build legacy. You'll decide something else, something that fits what you know and who you know and what you've spent your years getting good at. But the decision belongs to you, not to whoever sent that email. Whatever Trent Holland thought he was saying at 6:15 on that Tuesday morning, I spent the next 4 years writing my answer. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. I mean that. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this hit closest to home. I read every single one. The men who tried to make you smaller never imagined you'd use the empty space they left to build something bigger than what they took. Experience isn't a liability that expires. It's compound interest. The longer they ignore it, the more it's worth when you finally collect.